Speed tuning is pretty much the foundation of your team's rotations, and I've somehow never made a guide on it. So if you're new to the game or speed tuning, I'll explain how it works first. Let's start with action value. You can see this on the battle timeline on the left if you turn it on in the settings, which you should by the way, and you can think of this as time in the game. One action value is just per unit time, and characters based on their speed will usually have a fixed amount of action value. This is found by taking 10,000 and dividing that by your character's speed. So the higher speed your character has, the lower your action value will be. Intuitively, having lower action value means you take a shorter amount of time to complete a turn. The reason why we care is because the content in Star Rail rewards you based on the action value you use to clear the stage. So for example, Memory of Chaos and Anomaly uses number of cycles, Pure Fiction has a fixed duration of 4 cycles, while Apocalyptic Shadow is just whatever remaining action value you have. So what speed tuning then aims to do is to try to maximize the number of turns a character can take within the boundaries of the stage, or if you're aiming for a certain number of cycles or action value. So you might have seen this image before where like if you have this amount of speed, you get X turns, you need X cycles or whatever, and it looks kind of complicated, so let's just ignore that for now. I want you to actually understand how speed tuning works, because the breakpoints you use are dependent on both the stage and your team. I'll be doing this by showing you 2 examples of when the breakpoints are actually less useful, and it happens in the same run. Here I'm using a 168 speed setup on Sparkle with Himiko Nova. Because my team is fairly well built already, I can easily clear the first wave on Sparkle's second turn. Usually it's much easier than the boss wave, the second wave. And this would have been the same as running 134 speed all the way to 199 speed. But because Sparkle is too fast here, well, doesn't get to take his last turn in the cycle, hence losing out on extra energy, and this will actually snowball into the next much harder wave 2, reducing your clear speed down the line. This case is actually having too much damage to reach the breakpoint, making the 161 breakpoint less useful because we only used 2 out of the 4 turns that we speed tune or that we hit the breakpoint for. So running too much speed here was actually counterproductive, and it would be better to run 134 speed, ideally slower than Welt in this cycle. The next issue is when you deal too little damage to properly utilize the breakpoint. Again, in this Himiko Nova run with 168 Sparkle, I'm not really using the optimal team or setup for this stage, but it does help to illustrate this. If after using the 4 turns from 161 speed, your team is still unable to clear the stage and require 1 more turn, the 161 breakpoint kinda becomes useless unless you require exactly 4 more turns again to clear, but this only really happens in Anomaly if you're aiming for 2 cycles, and it does not happen in this run. Because we overshot the breakpoint, you can even drop to 143 speed and it would still function virtually the same, and this would clear at the same speed in terms of cycles, except we would be able to convert some of that speed substats into crit damage, for example, to deal even more damage. So the takeaway from this isn't that the 161 speed breakpoint is bad, I'm just using it as an example. What I want you to understand is that even though speed tuning for breakpoints can be very strong if used correctly, if you're blindly following recommendations for certain breakpoints that aren't useful for you, you might actually end up hurting your clear speed instead. You cannot just slap a bunch of speed on your character and call it a day. When you speed tune, you need to understand what it does or what it tries to achieve, and then play for that breakpoint. So my goal for this guide is not just to teach the common speed breakpoints, but also to teach you why the breakpoints work and hopefully how to speed tune some basic stuff by yourself. So before I get into the common breakpoints I recommend, let's talk about action advance and changing speeds, because this also affects our breakpoints in game or in theory. Action advance is usually quite straightforward. So previously I mentioned the 10,000 divided by speed equals to action value thing. You can think of that as 100% of the character's turn or 100% total action value. So when you 100% action advance the character, it usually immediately becomes their turn, obviously, right? This is why we never run Dance on the old Robin, for example, because she already has an inbuilt 100% action advance, and in 99.99% of cases, 124% advance just doesn't do anything because you only require 100%. The reason why I say it's most cases is because there are very rare situations where your character is delayed by the enemy. In those cases, more than 100% advance can actually help, and this is calculated the same way as action advances. Instead of subtracting, you just add your total percentage action. On the other hand, we have changing speeds like Evernight and more recently Gilgamesh. These units are usually much harder to speed tune because they keep changing their speeds mid-turn. The way this is calculated in game though is also using the percentage action value. So for example here, Evernight has 130 speed and 24 action value left to her turn. So we can calculate this actually, and this is 31.2% of her turn remaining. Now, she gets a 32% speed buff from D22 Memoria, putting Evernight at about 162 speed. The game rounds some decimals by the way, so if you calculate it yourself, actually about 161-ish speed. And by the way, percentage speed buffs or changes are calculated using your character's base speed, not total speed. So even though we changed speeds, we have yet to action advance, so Evernight still has 31.2% of her turn left, even at this new speed. So all we really have to do is to recalculate her new action value remaining using the current percentage action value left. So what we do is we take 10,000 divided by her new speed, and then you multiply that by 31.2%, which would be around 20 action value. So just like it shows in game, this decrease in action value is not due to any action advance, but due to her increasing her speed. Now, we use 3B's dance, which is a 24% action advance. So all we do is we subtract that from 31.2%, which gives 7.2% action to go. Once again, we multiply that by the new speed, and this gives us the remaining action value, which is around 5 action value, once again, like it shows in the game. This means trying to use action advances when Evernight is slower to try and reduce the AV you take doesn't really work. Regardless of the order you take, it will still be the same. This can only reduce some action value if the speed buff is applied in between turns. So for example, action advance when I'm slower as compared to action advance when I'm faster will actually save a little bit of action value, but it's so little that the mechanic is just not very useful most of the times. It's just mostly kind of interesting to know. So consolidating what we know so far, the best way to speedtune is actually to do a case-by-case basis. You want to speedtune according to your team's damage and needs, and to the type of content you are dealing with, because different types of content require different action value. For example, a 161 speed build is really good if you're trying for 2 cycles in Anomaly King, because this comes out nicely to 500 action value, or just 2 times 250 action value, which is what it's speedtuned for. But if you want to 0 cycle the king, it's 300 action value instead. Hence, ideally, if you know you have enough damage to 0 cycle, you should go for 134 or 200 speed instead of 161. Obviously, this can be quite hard because it requires you to have quite an accurate understanding of your team's damage by, I guess, trying out the stage a few times. And it also sometimes requires having different relics for different speed tuning setups if you want to keep using the same team, for example. So for most cases, the 2 most important ones, in my opinion, that I recommend that you just use generally if you don't want to farm over and over, are 134 speed and 200 speed, or the equivalent of that via action advance or speed buffs. Because regardless of whether you have too much or too little damage, you will always have that 150 action value in most content, and Pure Fiction is 450, so 134 also works nicely there because it's a multiple of 150. The issue with this is that it can lose a little bit of action value in Apocalyptic Shadow, for example, because it doesn't use cycles and it's just purely action value remaining, but it's rarely a cause of concern. However, the best breakpoint in the game is the 200 or pseudo 200 speed breakpoint. This is because pretty much all the content in the game are in multiples of 50 action value, so you will always be maximizing your number of turns, and this is also extremely fast for Apocalyptic Shadow. So these 2 breakpoints are just very consistently useful, which is why I recommend those if you don't want to constantly change your builds or whatever. The breakpoints in between like 143 or 161, like I've shown, can be useful at times, but are slightly more niche and depend on whether you clear exactly at that breakpoint. Once again, it depends on your team's damage, so for you, maybe you might find that 161 or 143 actually does better than 124 at times. So I'll leave it to you to find it out yourself. You probably have to try a few times and see your average clear speed, but generally the higher investment you go, the better 134 and 200 will be, because you can 0 cycle the stages, which is usually multiples of 150 action value. So for me, that's generally what I've been using. The only exceptions are when I go for some really crazy 0 cycles like with Sele, or when I run teams with Mortonex because I want them to be faster than 140 speed. So at bare minimum, try to get 134. From there, you can adjust accordingly to your team's damage and the type of content you're dealing with. If you're in between breakpoints and quite far from the next, I do recommend just reducing your speed. to the previous one, otherwise you can run into issues like the one I showed earlier. Okay, so over here I have some speed breakpoints that I commonly use or I think people would want to use or I've calculated recently. Like in my Rin video, I did the 17 for around 0.8 speed, and this would be faster than Dance Eagle Sparkle at about 167.4. I have a bunch of others as well, 2 times Eagle or 1 times Dance with Morton X, the 200 speed as well. Just be careful of decimals in game. Like they don't show it to you. I do not know why they should just show the decimals to you so you don't have to waste your time, but you have to check in battle to make sure your breakpoint works, especially for breakpoints like 174.7. This might sometimes already show 175, I think. I'm not too sure. Just make sure you try it in battle and see if it works or not. These are, however, speed tuned mostly to 2 turns in 150 or 3 turns, so 134, 200 speed, because again, these are the more commonly used breakpoints. If you want to speed tune to 143, 156, 161, or to some other stage here, like 700 AV or 600 or 150 plus 650 and so on, you can do that. You just have to do it by yourself. I will be adding mostly the common breakpoints here. If you want me to add more common breakpoints that I might have missed, feel free to comment. I will probably update this sheet and I'll leave it in my Discord and in the description of this video. So if you're worrying about how to speed tune yourself, don't worry, I will go through that with you now. So in this scenario, I'm trying to get 4 enhanced skills before her zone ends with Dahlia and S1, and then you get 2 times S5 dance from Harmony MC. So what you want to do working backwards, you can just ignore the top part for now, I'll just zoom in for you. You want to find the target AV. So her zone is 70 fixed speed, so you take 10,000 divided by D70, and then you minus 1 or 0.1 or 0.01. If you want to be really accurate, you're going to go like 0.0001 or whatever, but honestly it doesn't really matter. And then you take the number of advances, and you subtract that from the number of turns you won. So I won 4 turns, and I get 2 times of 24% action advance, so it's 0.48. I take 4 minus 0.48, it gives me 3.52, and then you do some manipulation. You take 10,000 times 3.52, and you take that divided by your target action value, which would be this value over here, 142.84. This number here, 35,000 divided by D22, which is this thing here, and that gives me 246 speed. But Firefly has 60 flat speed during ultimate and 30% if you implant a weakness. So if you subtract that, which is 104 times 30%, because 104 is the base speed, you minus 60, and that gives you 155.2 to 1 decimal place, the same as the one I have here. If you have final S1, it will change because your base speed calculation will be different. You have to add 12, I believe. So then you would probably be able to get away with less speed substats. So I'm going to do one example here, and you can kind of just follow along if that example wasn't enough, because I've already done it all here. So this is the more recent Rin and Sparkle speed tuning I did for Archer in the Rin video. Basically, what happens is that you want Rin to be ahead of Sparkle. This way you can refresh the joint follow-up attack, and if you have Eagle down Sparkle, which is 3 turns in 150 action value, Sparkle will get 3 turns, right? So the issue is that one of the action advances is from Eagle, which is a 25% action advance, and she also has dance S5, but this is for the entire team. But because this is only for herself, there will be some cases, if you don't speed it properly, that Rin actually takes a turn after Sparkle, because she gets like almost 50% action advance on this second turn. Then what happens is you lose out on one joint follow-up in between, because Rin needs to take a turn to refresh the joint follow-up. So this speed tuning is meant to solve this issue and make it so that Rin always takes a turn ahead of Sparkle. So firstly, I can just find the speed tuning for Dance Eagle Sparkle again. So she wants to take 3 turns, and you have 35 and 24% extra advance, so it's 3 minus 0.24 minus 0.25, and our target AV is 150 action value minus like 0.1 or minus 1, whatever you want to do. And then we are going to take 10,000 times the number of turns divided by the target action value. That will give us 167.4, like you have seen over here. 167.4 is the same. So the issue in this speed tuning is the second turn. So I'm actually going to make one more calculation for the second turn specifically with the 167.4. Since it's the second turn, I just have to subtract 1 for the number of turns, so it's 1.51. Because what usually happens for Sparkle is she gets a 1 turn ultimate, right? She will use her skill, and then she will regenerate enough energy for ultimate. Very rarely, if the enemies are very fast and very aggressive, you can get the ultimate first, but that will mess up the speed tuning for this. So I'm just assuming it's the normal, generic, more common one where Sparkle has to use her skill first, so it's 1.51, and this gives us 90.20 action value. So next for Rin, what I want to achieve is Rin being faster than Sparkle on the second turn. So this is our new target action value actually. So target AV, I'm going to put it here. Take this minus 0.1. Basically, I want Rin to be around this action value. So she gets a percentage speed buff of 20%, which is 102 times 0.2. So later on, if I want to find the speed before the battle, I will need to subtract this number. And then she also gets the S5 dance because it applies to the entire team, so 0.24. And the turns remaining is 2 turns because I want this to be the second turn, subtracted by the dance action advance, so she gets 1.76 turns. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take 10,000 times the number of turns, which is 1.76, divided by the target action value. This will give me 195.33 speed. I'm going to take this, I'm going to subtract 20.4, so this is her speed before the battle, 174.9, which is why over here I've written 174.7 to 0.9. It just depends on how accurate you want to be with the decimal places. Like if you go like 0.01, yeah, it goes to 174.7. I think if you go like maybe like this, yeah, 174.8. It's just how accurate you want to be. Honestly, it doesn't really matter too much. So what you can just do is you just go 175 and then you will be fine. So now we can just prove it, I guess, make sure it's all correct. The first turn that Sparkle will take is like this, and the first turn Rin will take is like this. So you can see the Rin one is ahead, lower action value. Now the second turn is this one that we have already found, and then the second turn from Rin is the target action value here. It's like this, and then finally take this last. This will be the last turn, 141, and the last turn for Sparkle, 149.94. So what this does is that even though it overshoots a lot on the first and third turn, it makes sure that on the second turn, Rin is still ahead of Sparkle. You can see the action value is lower, 90.1 as compared to 90.2. So for some specific stages, you want to speed tune to the enemy as well. It's not really that complicated. It's quite similar to speed tuning to another character, like the one I just showed, Rin to Sparkle. This is usually for enemies that have a very important ability that allows you to clear faster, so like Flame Reaver or Swarm Nightmare, because it can give you an extra action advance. So I've done this with Swarm Nightmare back in 3.8 with Boot Heal. You break the boss and then this delays the enemy's action. So what I did was I calculated the amount of delay, and then I calculated how much speed Boot Heal would need so that his third turn is ahead of the Swarm Nightmare before it recovers. And then because this can give an additional action advance, Boot Heal will get 4 turns in the cycle instead of the normal 3 turns. And for Elysian, I also speed tune Sparksy's speed so that she can act ahead of Aha, but this is completely dependent on your other Elysian teammate speed, so it will differ from player to player depending on your builds and whether you have S1 or not, and so on and so on. If I was better at Google Sheets, maybe I could make some calculator for speed tuning, but I don't really know how to do that, so I'm not gonna do that. But generally, like I've showed, it's just a few lines of math. It's not that complicated. For the more complicated ones, you can just leave it to me to work that out for you in the character guides if it's more common. If it's a very niche speed tuning that you want to look at for whatever reason and you are unable to speed tune it properly or get it to work, you can just leave a comment in this video or in my Discord. I will probably try and help you to solve that when I have the time. I think generally it only gets a bit complicated when you have like Evernight and Action Advance, or if you're trying to calculate Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is like actually borderline impossible because he keeps increasing his speed very often, so the action value you try to find that is really hard. So probably don't speed tune that if I were you. But that's it for my speed tuning guide. Hopefully you've learned something new here. Honestly, I'm a bit worried I didn't explain it that well, so feel free to leave any other questions you might have. But as always, thanks for watching.